AMD is getting some serious trouble. While AMD and Intel seemingly and successfully trade blows in the higher-end flagship CPU department, Intel's 13700K puts AMD's slightly more expensive 7900X to shame in many aspects. So how does AMD fare, and where exactly does Intel do so well in this specific price range, and thus apply so much pressure onto the competition? Today we are of course taking a look at the Intel Core i7 13700K with its total 16 cores and 24 threads based on Raptor Lake. The key to the i7 processor's success mainly lies in its price. In early December 2022, we have to spend about $440 to $460 on the 13700K. The AMD CPU that's most likely comparable might be the Ryzen 9 7900X, sporting 12 cores and coming in at $470 to $560. Prices tend to vary though, but there surely have to be advantages on the 7900X's side, right? Yes and no. As always, I've paid for all these Intel and AMD CPUs out of my own pocket, but still would like to send out thanks to Geizhals over at the online shop Equipper for getting a hold of all that stuff for me. Hashtag not sponsored. Architecture. As is already known with the predecessor, Alder Lake, Intel makes use of their new hybrid system when it comes to cores, meaning the 13700K comes with 16 cores in total. Out of these, only 8 of them are actually truly fast and sport high clock speeds. These are performance cores. The rest, the remaining half, are 8 slower efficiency cores that don't even support hyperthreading. And that's explaining the maybe somewhat confusing thread count of 24 while having 16 cores. As already mentioned in my previous video, Raptor Lake CPUs can be installed and run on 600 series motherboards, such as Z690 for instance. You will require a BIOS update though. If you're given the option, you therefore don't necessarily have to go with Z790 or any lower-end 700 series chipset. Furthermore, CPUs part of Intel's 13th gen lineup not only can be used with DDR5 RAM, but you can also keep using your DDR4 memory. That does lead to some CPU performance penalties, however. Test setup. I'll once again be installing the 13700K onto the ASRock Z790 Taichi motherboard, and this time too we'll go for some adjustments and fine-tuning to achieve higher efficiency. I'm also going with my usual Kingston Fury Beast RGB, DDR5 memory at 6000 MHz, 32GB and CL36 timings. As for the AIO liquid cooler, the Be Quiet Pure Loop 2 FX 360mm, since temperatures happen to be, well, fairly toasty once again. And last but not least, for the graphics card, the Asus RTX 3090 Tough Gaming OC to help limit any GPU bottleneck that might occur. Optimization and clock speeds. As I've already discussed in my i9 13900K review, you will come across deviations from motherboard to motherboard regarding preset out-of-the-box power limits for the CPU. So in the end, we have to ask ourselves the question what exactly we should consider as stock settings. Well, quite a few motherboards automatically, without any changes made, allow the CPU to draw more power. According to the official Intel specification, we should be looking at a max power limit of exactly 253 watts for the 13700K. We therefore should see some big differences in power draw and temperatures between these two configurations. Which is why I've gone the extra mile and went through the effort of running all the tests with both configurations. One being the automatic settings the motherboard sets for the CPU, and the other being the 253 watt power limit as specified by Intel for this particular CPU. To my surprise, there's hardly any difference in clock speed behavior between the two configurations, which is very promising indeed, and goes to show the 13700K can further be optimized. At full load, I could read out 5.3 GHz on the P cores and 4.2 GHz on E cores. The boost clocks match exactly Intel's official claims. That's 5.4 GHz on a P core and 4.2 GHz on an E core. Differences in clock speeds in-game, there were none for me. So all we need to check next is as to how well the 13700K stacks up against AMD's 7900X as well as 7950X, and maybe even the Ryzen 7 7700X. Performance, productivity. In the Cinebench R23 test, the 13700K is about 5 to 6% faster than the AMD 7900X. We are talking nearly 4% faster in this single-core run. The 13700K loses out to AMD's counterpart by a brutal 11% in the 7-zip benchmark, however. Also, in the following rendering test, V-Ray 5, AMD is able to take home victory, although we are merely talking of less than a 5% lead over Intel. Impressive, by the way, is the fact how consistently the 13700K does not seem to be negatively affected by the enforced power limit of 253 watts so far. Intel and AMD obviously perform exactly equally as well in the Corona rendering benchmark. That's clearly a tie. Very comparable results are witnessable in Blender. While AMD is slightly faster, it's not a major lead by any means. Intel is catching up in the Handbrake rendering test though, making AMD with their 7900X drop behind slightly. Furthermore, a 13700K is not that much slower than even a 7950X by AMD here in this test. When it comes to Vegas Pro 20 video rendering, the 13700K loses out to the 7900X though, but it needs to be said here that we once again aren't talking of huge gaps here. Gaming. The 3D Mark Time Spy test I kinda dislike. We see some fairly chaotic results. According to that test, the 13700K seemingly should do ever so slightly better than even the flagship 13900K in gaming. If there's any truth to that, we'll see. AMD CPUs are traditionally treated as second-class parts, as usual in this test. So let's fire up a real game then. Now we're talking, and the most recent CPUs are fighting it out nicely in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Intel is at the top here, and with their 13700K is not really any slower than a 13900K. Additionally, we start seeing the first perks of that 253 watt limitation. Not only does the official Intel spec lead to slightly higher average FPS, but even a 11% boost in 1% lows. We're still talking of one and the same CPU. AMD appears to be a bit slower here, but barely. In Borderlands 3, the 13700K once again enjoys being at that top, and is hardly any worse than the i9 flagship. AMD's 7900X and 7950X models, on the other hand, offer roughly 6% less FPS in this game. In the title Cyberpunk 2077, for the very first time now, the new i7 at its 253 watt setting is topping the chart. Needless to say, AMD does offer great performance too, but is about 10–11% behind Intel's new CPUs here. Once more, very similar results in the game Far Cry 6. Over all these years, AMD processors weren't treated well by the Far Cry titles. No exception here either. AMD CPUs do shine and show their strength in Forza Horizon 5 then. While the average frame rate might make it look like a tie, the minimum FPS certainly are looking better on AMD's side. A 17% smoother gaming experience with AMD in that specific game is pretty impressive. In the by now very dated GTA 5, most decent CPUs spit out close to identical frame rates. Intel does appear to be offering slightly higher 1% lows, however. A little more battling action, luckily, can be seen in Horizon Zero Dawn. A 13700K is on par with a 13900K here. The i7 maybe even being a little faster. With a small lead of almost 4%, AMD is taking home victory here. A very clear result and a win for the 13700K is to be witnessed in Metro Exodus. This is where even Intel's flagship isn't quite capable of holding on to its number one spot. AMD's 7900X drops behind by 7%. Intel's 13700K keeps reigning superior even in a game Red Dead Redemption 2, or let's say i7 and i9 deliver us a tie. But Intel is about 15% better than the 7900X here. There's no clear winner in Rise of the Tomb Raider though, albeit the nearly 4% higher 1% lows look better on Intel's side. But then again, you'd have to be hunting for flaws at this point. Same thing can be said about the results of the game's successor, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, while Intel and AMD go neck and neck here. For me, that's an obvious tie. Gaming average FPS. Needless to say, Intel with their 13700K is leading here, and that's by less than 4%. So can we even consider this a clear victory for Intel? I wouldn't say so, because those of you that are purchasing a CPU within this price range most likely are also going for a fairly expensive graphics card and likely game at resolutions of 4K UHD or maybe even 1440p. And that's where, realistically speaking, it honestly doesn't make much of a difference whether you go with the Intel 13700K or AMD 7900X when firing up your favorite game titles. AMD and Intel simply are very close to each other right now, which is why in games there's realistically not any major advantage with either of these two CPUs, neither by Intel nor by AMD to be found, with a few exceptions to this. It becomes obvious, though, that you can run your i7 processor at Intel's stated power limit without any decline in performance really. In the following tests, we see the great advantages of it: power consumption and temperatures. If you allow the motherboard to take care of the power limit settings, the 13700K on that ASRock board draws almost 450 watts from the wall. That's total system power. But by enforcing the 253 watt limit according to the Intel spec, we see a drop in power consumption by nearly 8%. The AMD 7900X at stock settings, so without any optimizations, is much more power efficient. In my test, separating the 13700K and 7900X are 105/140 watts, or in other words, AMD draws 25 to 31% less power. Let that sink in for a while. We see slightly higher efficiency on the Intel part at idle, however, probably due to the E-cores. Not quite such a spectacular difference can be witnessed while gaming. Now there's just 27 watts separating the 13700K from the 7900X. When factoring in the overall higher theoretical performance in games, I can't really complain about the i7 model that much here, I guess. The temperatures, as usual, are fairly high for both CPU giants. The 7900X I managed to cool down to 90 degrees Celsius with a 360mm AIO liquid cooler. As far as Intel is concerned, depending on the power limit setting, we are ranging from 96 to 100 degrees, so definitely a toasty chip. Unlike with the 13900K, the 13700K at mentioned temperatures is able to maintain its clock speeds without any drops at all times. Same goes for AMD. But in general, I would have wished for both CPU makers to aim for more conservative power limits. As it is now, it's just a crazy game of who can pump more power through their CPUs, with very little regard to power efficiency. Luckily, I can bring you enthusiasts some good news here, and that's that by doing even minor adjustments within the BIOS, power consumption and temperatures can be reduced drastically. That applies to both Intel and AMD. While I didn't have any success with undervolting the flagship 13900K, with today's 13700K on the other hand, I achieved beautiful results at 100% stability. While even with that particular optimization, we are still seeing a higher power draw than on AMD CPUs, the amount of power we are drawing now is in a much more acceptable range. And the best part, these optimizations didn't lead to any noteworthy performance losses, so it's totally worth it to do some fine-tuning here. Conclusion. Let's first discuss from the technical point of view. In terms of pricing, at this point in time, we probably should be comparing the 13700K against the 7900X, even though AMD's option does cost a bit more. When it comes to rendering and overall productivity workloads, there's no obvious winner between Intel and AMD. Although at the end of the day, I'd probably still grab the 7900X over the 13700X for productivity stuff. The lower power draw is a major factor here, because Intel isn't doing so well in that particular aspect, that is efficiency. So for really long rendering projects, it's definitely something to keep in mind. In games, however, the 13700K is better by a few percent, even though in a more practical sense, we'd hardly notice any difference anyway. Still, the results speak for themselves. The choice is getting harder between these two CPUs when having to factor in the price. This is where Intel certainly has an advantage. Not only does the CPU cost less, but so does the whole LGA 1700 platform. So if you're living in the here and now, basically the present, one has to admit Intel certainly is applying some pressure on AMD. You do have to keep in mind, though, that AMD is providing us more PCIe lanes, something that can be an advantage in the long term. But for right now, especially for most gamers out there, not really that big of a deal yet. At the end of the day, you have to ask yourselves one core question. Within the platforms in question, do you wish to upgrade sometime down the line? While AMD's more expensive AM5 platform supposedly should be supported until 2025, Intel's LGA 1700 platform, on the other hand, is standing with one foot in the grave already, since we shouldn't be seeing any future CPU upgrade options for it. So if you don't care about platform longevity alone due to overall lower costs, Intel has the edge over AMD for the majority of enthusiasts and gamers out there. If that's the case, then AMD's offering is in danger. But it's best to consider all the factors involved when making a choice. It therefore is not an easy decision to make. In the end, it all comes down to you, maybe even the price you're ready to pay, and maybe you'll also have to let sympathy decide. With that said, thank you so much for watching, and until the next one.